For most of history, philosophy has been told as a story about men. But that story isn't true, because some of the most fascinating philosophical ideas in history were written, taught, and lived by women, many of whom were ignored, erased, or rediscovered centuries later. Tonight, we're going to meet a few of them. And by the end of this video, the history of philosophy might look very different. Part 1. The missing half of philosophy. When people think about philosophy, certain names usually come to mind: Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Nietzsche. But philosophy was never a men-only conversation. Women have been asking the same deep questions for thousands of years. What is truth? What is justice? What does it mean to live a good life? The difference is that their voices were often pushed to the margins. Sometimes they weren't allowed to publish. Sometimes their work was credited to men, and sometimes history simply forgot them. But the ideas survived. Let's start more than 2,000 years ago. Part 2. The philosopher who taught Alexander. Let's travel back to the 4th century, to the vibrant city of Alexandria. Here lived a philosopher named Hypatia. She was a powerhouse of intellect, teaching mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy to students who flocked from all over the Mediterranean. Her classroom wasn't hidden away. Hypatia took her knowledge to the public, lecturing in the streets, engaging in fierce debates, and even advising political leaders. She followed Plato's tradition, believing that reason and math were the keys to unlocking the universe's truths. Her students saw her as brilliant, calm, and absolutely fearless. But Alexandria was a city on edge, simmering with religious tension. Tragically, in the year 415, Hypatia was murdered by a mob. Her death was a shock that rippled through the ancient world, often seen as a symbol of classical philosophy's decline. But was this the end for women in philosophy? Not by a long shot. Part 3. Philosophy through nature. Forward to the 12th century. In medieval Germany lived a woman named Hildegard of Bingen. She was a composer, scientist, mystic, and philosopher. At a time when most women had almost no access to education, Hildegard wrote extensively about nature, ethics, medicine, and spirituality. Her philosophy centered on a powerful idea. Human beings are deeply connected to the natural world. She believed that the universe had a living harmony, a kind of cosmic balance between nature, humanity, and the divine. When that balance breaks, suffering follows. Today we might call that idea ecological thinking. But Hildegard was writing about it nearly 900 years ago, and she did something unusual for her time. She wrote confidently, she challenged authority, and she expected people to listen. Part 4. The radical idea of equality. Now we move to the 18th century. The Enlightenment was spreading across Europe. Philosophers were talking about liberty, rights, and reason. But there was a problem. Most of those rights applied only to men. Enter Mary Wollstonecraft. In 1792, she wrote a groundbreaking philosophical work, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Her argument was simple but revolutionary. Women are not naturally inferior to men. They only appear inferior because they are denied education. If women had equal access to education and opportunity, she argued, they would develop the same rational capacities as men. Today, this may sound obvious, but in the 18th century, it was explosive. Wollstonecraft wasn't just arguing for better treatment of women. She was redefining what equality meant. Her ideas would later influence movements for women's rights around the world. And interestingly enough, her daughter would go on to write one of the most famous novels in history, Frankenstein. Part 5. The Philosophy of Becoming. Jump ahead to the 20th century. In Paris, a philosopher named Simone de Beauvoir was asking a question that still echoes today. What does it mean to be a woman? Her 1949 book, The Second Sex, became one of the most influential philosophical works of modern feminism. In it, she wrote one of the most famous lines in philosophy. One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. What does she mean? De Beauvoir argued that society shapes Gender roles. From childhood, people are taught expectations about how women should behave, think, and live. Those expectations slowly construct what we think of as womanhood. Her work helped launch modern discussions about gender, identity, and social conditioning. And whether people agree with all her conclusions or not, her ideas permanently changed philosophical conversations. Part 6. The Quiet Influence. Here's something really interesting. A lot of women philosophers weren't just sitting around writing books. They were teachers, they were translators, they were intellectual partners who sparked major debates. Take Emily du Châtelet, for example. She translated Isaac Newton's groundbreaking work, The Principia, into French. And get this, her translation is still the one used today. Then you have Hannah Arendt, who lived through the horrors of World War II and completely changed how we think about power, totalitarianism, and personal responsibility. And thinkers like Iris Murdoch brought philosophy back to everyday life, exploring big questions through the lens of character, love, and just paying attention to the world around us. These women didn't just argue about old ideas, they fundamentally changed the questions philosophy was asking. Part 7. The first professional female philosopher. Another fascinating figure is Harriet Taylor Mill. For many years, she was known primarily as the intellectual partner of the philosopher, John Stuart Mill. But historians today increasingly recognize that she played a major role in shaping his ideas about liberty, equality, and women's rights. Harriet Taylor wrote essays arguing that society had artificially limited women's potential. She believed that if men and women were given equal freedom and opportunity, society as a whole would become more creative, more just, and more intelligent. Mill himself admitted that many of the ideas in his famous work, The Subjection of Women, were developed together with Harriet. In other words, some of the most influential liberal ideas of the 19th century may have been a collaboration. Part 8. Hannah Arendt and the Banality of Evil in the 20th Century. Another woman philosopher helped the world grapple with one of the darkest chapters in human history. Hannah Arendt fled Nazi Germany and later reported on the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the organizers of the Holocaust. What she observed shocked her. Eichmann did not appear to be a monster. He seemed ordinary. From this observation, she developed one of the most unsettling philosophical ideas of the modern era, the banality of evil. Arendt argued that great evil in history is not always carried out by villains who see themselves as villains. Sometimes it is carried out by ordinary people who stop thinking critically about what they are doing. People who simply follow orders, people who conform. Her work forced philosophers and historians to rethink how responsibility, obedience, and morality work within large systems. Part 9. Why weren't they included? So why don't we hear about many of these thinkers in traditional philosophy courses? There are a few reasons. For centuries, universities didn't admit women. Publishing was restricted, intellectual circles were often closed, and history tends to remember those who had the power to write the narrative. But in recent decades, scholars have been rediscovering forgotten voices. Manuscripts have been re-examined. Letters have been studied. And suddenly the philosophical conversation looks much larger than we once thought. Not a monologue, but a dialogue. Part 10. Going forward. So, what's the big takeaway from all this? Maybe it's that philosophy isn't just a list of famous names and dusty books. It's a massive, ongoing conversation that spans centuries. It's ideas sparking new ideas, questions building on older questions, and when we bring those forgotten voices back into the mix, the whole picture of philosophy changes. It stops looking like a narrow, exclusive club and starts looking more like what it truly is, a vast, global human project. It's people everywhere, from all walks of life, trying to figure out this crazy thing called existence, trying to understand each other and trying to understand themselves. They say philosophy is the love of wisdom, right? Well, true wisdom rarely comes from a single voice. It grows from many perspectives, many experiences, and many minds wrestling with life's biggest mysteries. The history of philosophy is still being written, and as we uncover these once overlooked voices, the story just gets richer, more complex, and maybe, just maybe, a little closer to the truth. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed. Don't forget to like and subscribe to The Human Rhythm for more.